controversy in that Woodland thing. In that Woodland.
Not yet. I'd like to call to order the Committee of the Whole this Tuesday, May 24th of the Cuyahoga County Council. This is for the confirmation hearings for the appointment of the medical examiner. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Yes, Madam Chair. Mr. Miller?
Present.
Brady? Mr. Germana? Mr. Gallagher?
Here.
Mr. Schron?
Here.
Ms. Conwell?
Here.
Mr. Jones?
Here.
Mr. Rogers? Ms. Simon? And Mr. Greenspan? Here. And Ms. Conley?
Here. There being a quorum present, we may proceed. Is there has anyone signed in for public comment?
No, Madam Chair, no one has signed in to speak.
All right. Today, Council will consider the appointment of Dr. Thomas Gilson as Cuyahoga County's first medical examiner. As in previous confirmation hearings, I will explain the process Council will follow and summarize the charter provisions under which Council exercises its authority to hold these hearings. For each nominee, we have asked Mr. Fitzgerald to submit a letter of nomination with the nominee's resume and documentation of the nominee's qualifications as required by the Charter and the Ohio Revised Code. Once Mr. Fitzgerald submits his nominations, the 30-day time frame in which Council must act begins to run. Council received these materials for Dr. Gilson on May the 3rd. The hearing will proceed as follows. We will begin with the time for public comment for those who have signed in, and apparently no one has signed in. Dr. Gilson will offer an opening statement addressing his qualifications, motivations for seeking the position, and outlooks and plans regarding the office. Council members will then ask questions of the nominee. We will do so in rounds, allowing each member to ask 3 questions per round until all questions have been answered. Once all questions have been asked, and assuming Council is ready, we will entertain a motion to recommend that Council consent or not consent to the nomination at its next regularly scheduled meeting. Assuming a motion to recommend consent or no consent has been made, Council will vote on the recommendation at the next regular meeting. The medical examiner is an Article 5 officer appointed by the executive, subject to the confirmation by Council, and serving at the pleasure of the executive. The medical examiner is responsible under Section 5.03 for all powers vested in or imposed on county coroners under general law. In addition, the medical examiner shall also have such powers and duties as the Council shall establish by ordinance, so long as those powers and duties are not inconsistent with those of county coroners under general law. As for qualifications, the medical examiner must be a licensed physician and shall have specialized training in forensic medicine and pathology. Thank you again, and let us proceed. Dr. Gilson, if you take the hot seat, please. And you may be seated. You may be seated.
Oh, okay.
And we don't need to take, do we need to take a state testimony under oath? We have not.
I'd be happy to if you want.
We have not in the past. All right, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I just wanted to thank the councilmen and councilwomen, too, for your consideration today for my candidacy for the first medical examiner position in Cuyahoga County. This, I think, is a very exciting opportunity for me. And I hope in the next few minutes in this statement to give you an overview, some about myself, some about my qualifications, and some about my vision and goals should I become your first medical examiner. With regard to my background, I am a son of the city of Philadelphia. My late father was a lawyer and my mother is a retired school teacher. I have 3 older brothers. I'm one of 4 brothers. I'm the youngest. And I grew up in a very, very supportive environment. And I certainly appreciate the values of family And from them, I also learned values of hard work, the true value of education, and the purpose of our lives to be of service to other people. I can't remember the first time I wanted to be a physician. I know from early on I wanted to be a scientist. I had a wonderful uncle who was a family practitioner for several years in Philadelphia, and an older brother who was a primary care doctor as well and a pulmonary doctor. They certainly inspired me. When I was a kid, my older brother used to use me as his anatomy model to practice listening with the stethoscope and things, and it colored me a lot in terms of liking medicine. We're still very close. I went to college as a chemistry major and became a pre-medical major at St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia, and I performed my medical degree studies at the Medical College of Pennsylvania. Following that, I went to the Hershey Medical Center, which is Penn State's medical center, to study surgery, and I did not wind up in that profession. I spent 2 years as a surgery intern and surgery resident. And I can say that at the time I left that, I was very disappointed, but what it taught me is that things don't always work out the way you think on the first bounce, and that sometimes you learn a lot just by doing something, and even if it doesn't work out, I still treasure the fact that I have decent skills as a clinical physician, even though I don't see patients anymore in that kind of a capacity. Then I came to Ohio. I came here in 1990, and I did my training in pathology, which is the larger field that I work in today. I was on the other end of the state at the University of Cincinnati. That for me was a very fortuitous opportunity because that training program has actually had a reputation since my time of turning out a number of forensic pathologists. I was very blessed to be able to go to New York City to do my training for forensic pathology. That's the area that I work in today, and I'll talk more about that as a discipline. But you can imagine, for the kind of business that I do, New York City was an ideal place to learn, given everything that can happen in that wonderful city. In addition, though, to that kind of material, those interesting cases and things and like that, I had the opportunity to work with a wonderful teacher, Charles S. Hirsch, who was still the medical examiner in New York City, and he has a Cleveland connection I'll talk about in a little bit. But he stressed the importance of us not only to be good in criminal things, but also to understand the public role of what we do. I carry that with me today. It's a very important part of what I do, and I'll elaborate on that in a few moments as well. In New York City, I finished my training. I stayed on staff there. In 3 years, I rose to the position of deputy chief, acting deputy chief, which is still the fastest time that anybody rose to that position in that system. I'm very proud of that. And I was tasked with running the office on Staten Island, which was a good learning experience and a good introduction to administration in addition to the science of my work. I would go on from there to work primarily in New England over the next years, usually in a capacity as a administrative as well as forensic pathologist. I've served as deputy chief medical examiner in New Hampshire and in my current position in Connecticut. And for 4 years, I was the chief medical examiner in the state of Rhode Island. That's a mix of settings, and I think that that's a benefit to any job because I've seen different ways to do things, and I've seen different environments from a big urban area with a lot of high-profile things to quieter jurisdictions that still have a lot of challenges for a person in my field. I feel prepared, based on that experience, to be a candidate for this position, and I hope I've clarified some of that. I thought I'd go in briefly to what I actually do, forensic pathology, and how I view this and how I bring that vision to the work I would do if I were confirmed by you. The definition of forensic pathology, as I give it in court when I'm asked, is it's the medical field where we take principles of medical science and apply them to death investigation. Frequently, I'm given the joke that my patients don't talk, and that's a benefit. What I actually try to do, though, I think, in my work is to give a voice to those people who are unfortunate enough to come to our office. And sometimes they have a tremendous amount to say. It just needs somebody to interpret it. I think the most obvious thing that gets associated with my office, especially in popular media, are criminal cases, homicides, murders, and things like that. Obviously, the administration of justice is a critical part of what a coroner's office does. Treating people fairly, holding people accountable for actions that are not good, and having people not falsely accused of actions that are not good is an important part of what we do. On a different level, though, forensic medicine has a tremendous number of other applications that fall behind the scenes. Accident prevention. All accidental deaths in the jurisdiction are certified by a medical examiner and should be investigated by the medical examiner's office. I always say, especially about workplace injuries, which is an area of interest for me from a research perspective, it's a tragedy when one person loses their life in the workplace. It's a double tragedy if somebody else dies because we didn't recognize the problem that caused the first one to die. I mentioned Dr. Hirsch, my teacher's commitment to public health. The word origin for this field, forensics, is public. It's not criminal. Forensic medicine is public medicine. It's imperative for me to remember that. You had an excellent, wonderful coroner here named Elizabeth Balrush, who I consider a very inspirational person who stayed very connected to her community. And I consider that an important part of what we do. I need to serve the public, and that can come in a lot of different ways. People who come to the medical examiner's office are not coming at a high point in their life. It's imperative to remember that we have to do everything we can to make this sad point in their life as bearable as possible, at least not to encumber it with additional problems. I think that that relates to timeliness of what we do in terms of getting our work done so that a person can be buried in a timely fashion, and also getting our paperwork done, especially death certifications, because people may have insurance riding on those things that if I haven't been able to finish paperwork may be held up, again, at a time when they don't need extra burdens. Other things that I've been able to do academically is to try to foster relationships with institutions, educational institutions. In my capacity as chief, I was able to really firm up our relationship with Rhode Island Hospital, which was the main teaching hospital in my state of Rhode Island. My experience and my background research shows that the office already has a good relationship with Case Western and with the Cleveland Clinic, and I would certainly try to at least keep them where they were, if not make them better. I would plan to make them better. Another area that I just would like to share a story which I think relates to our public medicine and the public function of my office is relating to organ donation. A lot of people who come to the medical examiner's office may be potential organ donors. I very much support organ donation. It's a critical need in our society to have those things available for donation, especially if a family is very desirous to do it. And if I can digress for a second into a story, when I came to the state of Rhode Island, the relationship between the medical examiner's office and the organ procurement organization was terrible. They were at each other's throats. I met one of the legislators within about 2 weeks of arriving there who told me that he didn't like the way the medical examiner handled organ procurement. I can tell you by the time I left there, they had asked me to consider sitting on their board of directors because I honestly wanted to roll up my sleeves and work with them to facilitate what I think is a wonderful wish for a family to pass on from somebody they don't have anymore. To wrap things up, I would talk about Cleveland and why I would like to come here if you choose to confirm me. I was in Cleveland. Our National Medical Examiners meeting was here last fall. I had absolutely no idea I would be sitting in this chair today asking your confirmation. I just was coming here to attend a conference with my colleagues. I certainly was impressed as I walked through the facility at what was being done there. And a couple of months ago, I just had a conversation randomly with a colleague of mine who asked me if I had seen the job in Cleveland. I don't even know why he asked. I wasn't really talking to him about that. And I said I had, and it said it was the medical examiner. And I thought it was an entry-level position, and I said, you know, in the middle of my career, I'm not going back to an entry-level position. He said, oh, no, this is actually the medical examiner to replace the coroner and to take up the helm of the agency. I got interested in that for a couple of different reasons. I've always professionally had that as an interest, but I started to grow away from it as to actually take up the task of founding a new system. I don't have to do that here in honesty, but I think there is the opportunity to instill vision and precedent if I'm fortunate enough to be confirmed. I would certainly bring those principles that I mentioned in my summary of forensic pathology to that task, because I still want to emphasize again and again the commitment to public service that I mentioned, and how the medical examiner, I hope I made clear, has a tremendous opportunity to do that. From a personal perspective, my wife is from Columbus and my children are relatively young. Her family still lives in the Columbus area. Her mom, her stepdad, and a couple of her brothers. I'd like my children to be raised around there. My own family in Philadelphia is fairly fragmented, as you might guess from my own resume. We move around a lot. But I'd like that opportunity to have my children raised in a family environment. I also am humbled to sit here for consideration to run an office that has a fabulous history. I don't know if people are aware of Cleveland's stature in the history of forensic pathology. I mentioned Dr. Balraj, for whom I have a tremendous amount of respect as a person who kept the public health perspective in my field. Prior to her being coroner, she was preceded by a gentleman named Samuel Gerber, who was coroner for a very long time and from whom the building is named. I didn't know much about Dr. Gerber, but one of his deputies was a fellow named Lester Adelson. Lester Adelson taught my teacher forensic pathology, and from everything I've read that he's written, and he wrote a major textbook, one of the first textbooks in forensic pathology, he was a very, very brilliant man. I had the opportunity in 1996 at a national meeting to shake Lester Adelson's hand, and I used to tell the trainees when I was in New York City, I shook Lester Adelson's hand. He's a great pioneer in my business, especially in the areas of child death investigation. I would also mention Dr. Irving Sunshine, who was a pioneer in forensic toxicology, and Dr. Alan Moritz, who was the chair of pathology at Case Western, in addition to being a forensic pathologist. I've never heard of that before. Dr. Moritz was a pioneer in investigation of trauma deaths, particularly fire deaths, which dated back to the Second World War. This office has a very storied tradition, and I certainly would hope that I can contribute to that. I would be naive if I didn't mention that I was aware of the recent history of this office. I think that the troubles surrounding the office are concerning. They're not unknown to me. I don't profess to have a in-depth knowledge of everything that happened there, but I certainly don't have a blind spot to some of those things. If confirmed, I have an experience that I think will be helpful in trying to bring some of the stature back to the office that it may have lost in recent times. I think, as I see it, the effects of the scandal can be a demoralization of the staff, a loss of that public health mission because you're dealing with so many other problems, and the worst of all is the possible questioning of the integrity of an agency. When I went to Rhode Island to become chief medical examiner, I came in the wake of a chief who was forced essentially to resign under scandalous circumstances. I encountered those things. That's why I ticked off that list. I'm sure there may be other things that I didn't think of, but I encountered those things. With the help of a good team, and I was able to facilitate building that team, but I had wonderful people. And with the support of people above me, we turned that office around, where I was very, very proud of it by the time I left there. To do those kind of things, I had to require top-to-bottom accountability for myself and for the other employees. And I also considered it very important that we were validated externally by agencies that do things like accreditation. And one of the things that I talked to Executive Fitzgerald about is the need for the office to pursue an accreditation by my national professional organization, the National Association of Medical Examiners, which I think gives a good set of benchmarks for an office to pursue and to be in compliance with, to do good work. If you would confirm me, I would pledge to get the office into compliance with those standards. I think it's a good way to externally prove what I think is probably already true. It's a good office that can be better, and we can do very good work. I thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I have nothing more to add. Just thanks for the opportunity, Madam President, councilmen, councilwomen.
Questions? Ms. Simon?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome here and congratulations. And
Thank you.
Very impressive. I'm not going to ask 3 questions, and I'm going to ask one question about your vision and how that might incorporate public service in your role.
I have to admit I have areas that catch my attention more than others. And as I mentioned, workplace fatalities was something that I spent part of my career studying. I don't know what mechanism exists for us to explore that, but it's an area that I'm interested in seeing how they're investigated, certainly contributing quality work to those investigations, and maybe kicking in a little more to that. Another area that pretty much from the beginning of my career I've tried to study is the phenomenon of suicide. Suicide routinely grazes somewhere around the 10th leading cause of death in this country, with about 30,000 people taking their lives. It's a big public health problem. I was fortunate enough in Rhode Island to partner with a colleague in the Department of Health, and we were able to do a couple of things that are still ongoing. I haven't been that far away, but I'm just pleased they didn't collapse. We instituted a walk, which is a part of the Survivors of Suicide mission, which wasn't previously in Rhode Island. There wasn't anything like that there. And the other thing that we were able to do was to prevail on the Department of Health to give us space to have a day where it's called the Survivors of Suicide Day. It's the Saturday before Thanksgiving, so that we can remember people who took their own lives, who aren't with us anymore, and just kind of get together in an environment where we can share that with other people. I'm very proud of those things, and I would certainly try to do something like that. There's so many opportunities in what I do to kind of take sad information and hopefully turn it to something not so sad, but those are the ones that come to mind for me. And maybe I'll leave it at that. There's others. I certainly love when people come to the office that, I'm interested in forensics, and I don't try to dampen their enthusiasm when a high school kid tells me, I want to be a forensic, and I'm like, a forensic what? I don't want to dampen their enthusiasm. I'm happy to take some time to talk to them. Somebody probably did that, for me somewhere along the line, and I just can't put names on everybody, but those kind of things I think are very important to me.
All right, Mr. Schrein?
Thank you for coming here, Doctor, and glad to have you here in Ohio. Get you
Thank
back,
you, sir.
back to your roots, or at least part of your roots there, for your wife. In regards to the budget items and capital items, it's one that we need to explore because it's unfortunately a constraint we're all going to be under. Have you spent any time at the Gerber building itself and had a chance to look at it? Because when you read the transitional reports, it says that we are sorely lacking in capital improvements there, and it looks like it's a 10 to 12 year behind project. If you have, what have you seen? And if you've seen the capital needs, how would you then proceed to try to address those through some, I guess, ways and attempts to go about looking at the needs for the county?
Thank you for the question. Madam President, in response to the question, I would say that I have been to the Gerber building twice. I visited as part of a tour when our national meeting was here, and yesterday I went back as well. I don't profess to have a good working knowledge of everything that's going on in the building. There were certain areas that I thought were very well resourced, the photography department and some of the reconstruction areas. I don't know how I would improve those based on the knowledge that I have. In terms of capital resources, I think that in the present climate, things are a little bit tight, I think, for everybody, and I don't know how much we would be able to do in terms of increasing finances. I can tell you Rhode Island was a very strapped state financially the times I was there, and it really was the tip of the hat I owe to my team that they were able to step up and assume different functions, and we were able to accomplish more, I think, in terms of fulfilling our mission with personnel redirection than with the obtaining funds. We did obtain some funds and updated some equipment. I'm not as familiar with the equipment in the coroner's office to comment more.
Okay. Structurally, how would you see the best reporting structure to, if you had a white sheet of paper for the coroner's office, now the medical examiner's office, where should the lines of authority be? Where should the reporting be? your best interest as the medical examiner?
I think one of the things that attracted me to this position as I learned more about it is that the medical examiner directly reports up to the county executive. I have worked in systems where the medical examiner reported to the attorney general, reported to the commissioner of the Department of Health, and reported directly to the council when I worked in Arizona. I think of those, one of the most concerning ones for potential conflict of interest is when the medical examiner sits under law enforcement in terms of state police as it is in Massachusetts, or the attorney general as it was my experience in New Hampshire. I had a wonderful experience in New Hampshire because the tradition there was that we had administrative support from the Department of Justice and there was no meddling, but I hope that continued, and I know for a fact because my colleague was a good friend of mine that it did. But I've seen other offices where that hasn't really been the case, and that oversight has kind of resulted in meddling in cases that were of interest to the overseeing board, law enforcement. The Department of Health I find less problematic given the public health mission, but I appreciate that the Office of Medical Examiner in this jurisdiction is given enough regard that it's a direct report up to your county executive. I think that's a very good idea.
And you can't help but notice on your publishing, and you alluded to it earlier, that it looks like almost 3/4 or more of at least your published studies deal with the subject of suicide. I know you alluded to some of your backgrounds in regards to that. Is there more to that from the subject matter that we as a county need to be addressing all the way through, that as far as the subject of suicide? Because you can't help but read chemical suicide analysis and then other mechanical means of suicide. It looks as though this is one of your in-depth aspects as far as studying within the medical examiner side of the aisle versus some of the other forensic aspects of it.
I'll get back to you on that. I think suicide is a major public health concern in the United States because, as I mentioned, it's somewhere around 9, 10, 11 in our leading causes of death. That's a lot of people. More people die in 2 years by their own hand than died in the Vietnam conflict. That's a lot of people to lose. I don't forget that. I don't know why. It hasn't affected me personally in my immediate family. I think, one of the harder things in job that I do is when you talk to families, they're grappling to understand something. And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to just, a very distraught parent and said, we're trying to understand with a reasonable mind what's essentially an irrational act. I feel very badly for those people and their loss, and I guess that's what keeps me going, that I want to carry what I can from the autopsy room into the public health arena.
Do you feel that part of this role is to actually communicate and talk to the families immediately following the suicide, that you will have the outreach role as opposed to turning that over to somebody else, then public health or some other aspects of?
I think in my every capacity I've worked as a medical examiner, I've been receptive to families calling me, and I call them back and tell them what I can. And when I mentioned earlier that, sometimes my job, I view it as giving voice to people who no longer have a voice, I neglected one thing that I definitely wanted to mention, and sometimes that voice is talking back to their family. And I can't tell you how many times I've been able to tell somebody who asks me the question, did my father, did my mother, did my brother suffer? And I can say no, and they're very grateful for that. I think that's not only, part of a voluntary part of my job, it's an absolutely essential part of my job to be willing to talk to families. I know a lot more about what I did than fobbing that off on somebody else.
Thank you. Ms. Conwell?
Madam Chair, to Dr. Gilson, the position of Cuyahoga County Coroner will require you to use your forensic and pathological medical training to oversee many controversial duties with regard to determination of cause of death, such as questionable instances of cause in law enforcement cases and other potentially controversial prosecutorial inquiry. how will you ensure that the ethical integrity of this office is maintained at all times to provide impartial, concise reporting as to the determination of the cause of death?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Madam President, in response to that question, I would say that the medical examiner's office should not serve law enforcement. It shouldn't act against law enforcement. Our work overlaps, but it's not the same as what they do. And my teacher used to say, the body doesn't lie. The body says things to me. I interpret them without fear or favor. I have told law enforcement people things they did not want to hear, which I think honestly reflected the truth of the situation and the fact that things didn't proceed the way they were being portrayed. I appreciate concerns that people have about people who die in custody. They've lost a lot of their rights being in custody. And I really think an independent, objective medical examiner is probably the last voice they're going to have about what really happened. I take that very seriously. And I think it reflects back to personal integrity. I tell the truth about what I want. I don't have to be leaned on by people. And as I say, I've had people who didn't like what I told them. Law enforcement, sometimes family members. But my job is I'm just an observer formulating a cause of death from that. The things have already happened. I'm just understanding what happened.
Madam Chair, to Dr. Gilson, I want to piggyback on what my colleague Sharon asked. What types of systems do you think you'll put in place to assist grieving families? And will you train your staff to also be conscious of how they appear to grieving loved ones?
I think there's a couple things that we can do there. Some are direct, some are indirect. As I mentioned, I think one of the best pieces of direct interaction I can offer to a family is to take the time to talk to them, to address their concerns. I have worked in only one jurisdiction where we were required at the end of every autopsy to call next of kin. I don't know if that's a good practice because some people want to hear from you, some people do not. I certainly would hold anybody accountable who refused to call a family member back when they had an honest question to ask. That's an unacceptable behavior to me. I don't hide from family members. I think you can probably guess I encounter people who don't like what I tell them, but that's not a justification to say I don't want to talk to you. I invite people who disagree with me to get expert opinions from other people in my field. I think that that's the most direct service I can provide personally and the medical staff can provide personally. I think the appropriate functioning of the office in terms of timeliness of death certification is another big service to provide. That accreditation I mentioned by the National Association of Medical Examiners has built-in requirements for turnaround times. 60 days is a mild deficiency if things start to slip beyond that for 95% of deaths. And a major deficiency, which would fail your accreditation, is 90 days. I think they're very reasonable timetables. And that was one of the big issues that I was able to address in Rhode Island. When I got there, it was not uncommon that final death certification could take over 1 year. I don't know what that person was doing. I don't know what those people were doing, but they weren't doing their job. And part of what I had to do to address that problem was get the tiger by the tail, get the right data, because we were transitioning to a new computer system. And it was hard to figure out where all these things were falling through the cracks. Once we got that new computer system, every month before me, I reviewed how many cases were outstanding, and I personally followed up with the physician why they were outstanding and what was their game plan to finish them. That, I think, is a good way to treat a grieving family who might be waiting for insurance money or just flat-out closure of what happened.
One more question. Madam Chair, to Dr. Gilson, how would you handle the media scrutiny that so often becomes part of the coroner's job in terms of diplomatically disseminating information to news outlets and the public in a way that managers and balances both the media and the public's right to know?
I think you've hit the nail on the head, if I can respond, Madam President. We're balancing the public's right to know against an individual's right to privacy. And I think that those are never going to be 100% understanding of each other, for want of a better term. I think that there are matters of public record, cause of death, manner of death, that should be released. I prefer, if something needs to be clarified, to do so myself or through a person who I designated as a press liaison, and be available should clarification be required from me. I think, though, that if I had to really err on the side of, things, people don't come to my office for good reason. If there's information that isn't public record, I tend to respect family. If family wants to talk about it, I've talked to them and told them what was going on. They can make that decision. But beyond what's in public record, I certainly want to remain sensitive to families at a time when they're really not at their best.
All right, Mr. Jones.
Dr. Gilson, congratulations for getting to this point, and thank you for your presentation. My question is, there's been negative publicity about the coroner's office, about the hiring practices and maybe the qualifications of those there. Maybe you can share with us some of your experiences, your management style, as opposed to what you're necessarily going to do when you get there, but what type of, tell me a little bit about your style, how you would bring people together and everyone pulling on the same page, so to speak, at the coroner's office.
I would probably hearken back to my experience in Rhode Island because I was at the top of the agency there. When I got there, there was a lot of divisiveness in the office, which I think might have reflected the fact that there hadn't been a full-time chief in a year. There was a lot of intrusion, I felt, from outside agencies. And those made things very, very tough, I'll be honest with you. What I felt I needed to do was to sit down with my employees, and we would have what we called our labor management meetings. I had a supervisor and employees. I personally attended those meetings. I didn't have 100 employees there. I had 17, but they made enough trouble to be 100 some days, it felt like. But we sat down, and the importance there was I was present, so it was important to me, and what I would review with them was, are there duties that are assigned that you don't understand? Are there duties assigned that you don't have the resources to do? And as a supervisor, are there duties that aren't getting done? Are there duties you'd like to clarify? If I don't show somebody what my expectation is of a job, it's very hard to ask them to do it. So I think that communication is critical to part of the way I would intend on managing this agency, if you were able to confirm me. The other thing, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. That kind of accountability, I think, is critical. Beyond that exposition of expectations, you have to have tools to monitor it. What kind of follow-up are you doing? I couldn't meet with my employees once, spell it out, and expect it to happen. I have to follow up and see how things are going. Some things don't work, some things do. But if I'm communicating, we have a freer exchange of ideas. And I would say that was effective. The last thing that I was able to do, I hired employees on my time there. I only had one instance I can clearly remember where I had a phone call from someone, can you interview my nephew? I didn't give him the job. He wasn't qualified to do it. That's the way I think you restore the integrity of an agency. I just try to see what's the job description, who's the best qualified person. I still interview people because I don't think you can make a decision like that off a piece of paper. And some people come across better than others. And then I make the decision based on who I think is the best fit from there. And I don't listen to those folks who want to call and, talk about their nephew or something like that. That's not fair to the other people who are applying for that job.
Thank you. I'll share with you, 20 years ago, when I first became a funeral director, I found that the death certification and the time it took to get that certified death certificate, it created an opportunity for me to start a business of my own. I started an assignment business. I would buy insurance policies from funeral homes, my own and others in the Northeast area, because of the time it would take for death certificates and for funeral homes to get paid. So I made a lucrative business as a result of that. You mentioned a year in some other locations. 6 to 8 weeks is about the time that I've known over the last 20 years from our coroner's office. Do you see an even shorter window than 6 to 8 weeks? Is that practical? Now, I know there are some doctors who, if they're a family doctor and they know why a grandmother has passed, I can get a death certificate in a few days. And I know there's work that has to be done, so I don't expect it to be a day or so. But is 6 to 8 weeks typical, and can it be shortened?
I think that's a reasonable number. As I said, I quoted, what my professional organization holds out as national standards, and I think if we're at the 8 weeks, that's about the 60-day mark. I think you should have 95% of your cases finished by then. In honesty, the complexity of forensic work forces some cases to take longer to complete than others. If I need to do laboratory testing, toxicology, those tests take time. It's not quite the same as going to the hospital, having blood drawn, and getting a result back promptly because the specimen's been compromised by the fact that the person's no longer alive. It takes longer. Why you wouldn't have a death certificate almost the same day when someone was, say, in a car accident and died from their injuries, when someone shot themselves, when someone did something that I see at the table, I don't understand. I mean, I have to say I don't know the practice of the office, but that doesn't make sense to me. Why an autopsy report would be held up for those things, I would have to reconsider. When I got to Rhode Island, we wouldn't release an autopsy report until the toxicology was finished. It made it hard to track who was really accountable for long turnaround times for reports. It wasn't the medical staff, it was the laboratory. If I have that individual who hanged themselves or whatever, their toxicology may be very relevant. Were they taking their antidepressants? But in terms of actually finishing my report, not really. I can attach it to the report so that it can be interpreted later, but it doesn't need to hold up the report. And that was one of the changes I instituted in Rhode Island to move reports out, because I'm sorry to hear about that business, so I hope it did well for you. The fact is, some insurance companies will work with you with a death certificate. Some will even work with you with a pending death certificate. Some will not work with you until they have a final autopsy report. I need to move out whatever they need, whatever they want, as quick as I can. And I think that those are tools that I've used in the past to try to make that happen.
Thank you.
Mr. Miller?
To Dr. Gilson, can you tell me to what extent you think the efficiency of the day-to-day operations in the medical examiner's office can be improved, and how you would go about doing so?
No, but I'm sorry, Madam President. In response to the question, I'm not on the ground there yet. I walked through yesterday. I've spoken to some of the staff there. I certainly, knowing what I've heard from different individuals, particularly about the timetable that we're talking about for death certification for autopsy reports, I would expect that efficiencies should be doable to get us in compliance with national recommendations. They wouldn't be national recommendations if they were impossible to comply with. They're minimum standards. We can always try to do better, But if we're not meeting those minimum standards, to answer your question, I would expect we should be able to improve efficiency. What that looks like, I can't say because I'm just not close enough to the agency yet.
Dr. Gilson, in your current occupation, what percentage of your time is administrative and what percentage is actually the forensic, working in the lab or working at doing autopsies? Is that kind of 50-50 or?
In my current position, no. I did almost 400 forensic cases last year, which is out of compliance with national standard. I spent a lot more time doing forensic work, and it was one of the reasons that I was interested in moving away from that office. I was also an administrator, and I would say probably was taking up somewhere between 10, maybe 25% of my time at most. I just didn't have enough time to do my casework and to be an administrator. And I think that one of the issues that you can have in that role as a player manager is just you got to play the game. I can't tell people you have to wait days and days while I'm administrating. I think your administrative function suffers if you're required to spend that time doing casework, but that's a public service priority to actually do casework.
I had experience with deadly force shooting cases a number of years ago, and the police show up and they take a bunch of pictures, and then the coroner shows up and they do an investigation. Is there a protocol in this relationship between the police and the coroner's office in terms of who gets there first, and are they working together? Are they working separately? Do you have any comments on that, or if you had experience in that?
I have experience with it in my previous jurisdiction in Rhode Island, Madam President. I can't speak to exactly protocols in this office here. What I would say was a typical scenario as much as possible under those circumstances is that the police respond to a scene faster. They don't call the coroner, the medical examiner when somebody dies. They call EMS police. They are required by statute to notify the medical examiner, and then my office in Rhode Island would dispatch a scene investigator. That person would interact with law enforcement at the scene because they're a source of information. I have to make that completely clear, though, that we did not work for law enforcement. And as I said earlier, that can't be an acceptable relationship because it has too much potential for conflict of interest, particularly in the scenario that you mentioned. From there, my investigator would take pictures to document what he or she saw, would glean as much information as possible, interviewing primarily law enforcement, but also people who would provide information. That would be my initial source of information. In any jurisdiction that I've worked in, those deaths were either handed over to another law enforcement agency. In Rhode Island, if it was a local jurisdiction, they were investigated by the state police who had no link to that local jurisdiction, or they were referred to an internal affairs group who were supposed to be separate from there. They would conduct interviews with individuals. And one of the things that I do in my work is I compare what was said versus with what the body said. And as I said earlier, the body doesn't lie. If I don't see on the body what I'm being told happened, there's a problem there.
And lastly, what are your plans in terms of moving to Cleveland?
My wife and I came out this weekend, actually, and we scrambled with a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old around the eastern suburbs, the ones right outside where the office is, to try to find a place to live. I think we're about this close to finalizing something. I plan on renting a house for the initial period and then purchasing a home when we get the lay of the land a little better, Madam President.
Thank you. Mr. Gallagher?
Doctor, in Rhode Island, how many investigators were in the office?
We had 5.
You had 5?
Yes.
You're going to have more when you get over there. I don't know the exact number. I think you're
I believe it's somewhere, I want to
Like
say,
18.
I thought it was somewhere 10 to 15, but I don't, it might
Yeah.
be, you may know better than.
Well, you know better. Do you need 15?
I think, I can't say, I don't want to make a judgment not knowing what their function is here. If they're doing other things beyond scene investigation, I would say that may not be unreasonable. The National Association of Medical Examiners also generated a data study. How many investigators should you have per population? The number was about 1 in 70,000. For Rhode Island, with a population of 1 million, we were significantly under what they recommended. The difficulty with doing a number like that is jurisdictions aren't the same. Rhode Island's a very small state. Its population is more than Wyoming, but I think I would need a lot more scene investigators in Wyoming because they would need more territory to cover. And if you're going to respond promptly to a death with a scene investigator, you have to have enough people to cover the territory as well. Cuyahoga County's geographical distribution is not significantly larger than Rhode Island. The population is about 50% more, and that's the other thing that could potentially impact the number of investigators you need, because your crude death rate in any population is determined by how many people live there. So that may justify more. I would certainly think that part of the review I would be trying to do would be to see if there are areas where we potentially are overstaffed and seeing, do we really need all these folks? And that's a fair one if you have so many more investigators, to see if we really do need all these folks or not. But I can't speak, in specifics without really being on the ground.
It's interesting. You say that there pretty much has to be a wall between you as the investigator, as the coroner, medical examiner, and police and an authority like that. Most of these inspectors seem to have been retired police officers. A little bit of a conflict there, or is that needed? Do you need somebody with that on-the-ground experience to come in and respect that wall that you want?
That's a very good question. My experience with investigators has been they tend to fall into one of 3 backgrounds. They have a medical background, physician assistant, nurse. They have a law enforcement background, or they have a funeral directing background. I think all of them have legitimate skills that they bring to the table. I honestly believe the question you raise about the integrity of a scene investigator with a background in law enforcement is genuine, and that needs to be supervised by somebody above that level. If I have any sense that investigations are being compromised because of a fraternity between a scene investigator and law enforcement, I can't have that person work without compromising the integrity of the agency. I think that that's such a fundamental point. My experience with investigators and law enforcement has been nothing but good, I can say. I've not encountered an incident of that in 17 years where I thought an investigation was compromised because a medical examiner employee basically was part of some attempt to cover up the truth because of a feeling towards brothers or sisters in law enforcement. I just haven't seen it, and I wouldn't intend to tolerate it either.
Thank you, Doctor.
Any further questions? Anything that you'd like to say to kind of wrap up your presentation?
Well, thank you very much for your time. I didn't need to drink any of the water. I don't know how long we went, but I hope I gave you a decent overview of what my experience is and what my vision is. As I said, I really am very, very honored to be considered for a position where my teacher trained, where his teachers worked. And I would very much like to stress, too, that I intend to do the best job I can. That's something I was going to say about my parents and the values they gave us. I just want to do the best job that I can. I think this is a great place to do that. I think the recent troubles in the office are fixable, or I wouldn't have ever come here to sit before you today. And I really hope to be able to come back here sometime in the future and tell you things are going very well. And I honestly believe I can do that. And I hope you give my application serious consideration. Thanks very much, Madam President, and everybody else.
All right, thank you, Dr. Gilson. Is there a motion?
Madam Chair, I move that we confirm him. We'll move him toward our regular,
Refer to our regular meeting for consideration.
refer to our regular meeting.
All right, second? It's-
Second.
All right, it's been moved by Mr. Jones, seconded by Mr. Miller. Is there any further discussion? All right, all those in favor indicate by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, we will refer this matter for our next regular meeting for confirmation. Thank you, Dr. Gilson.
Thank you very much.
And I would like to point out, we have asked every other nominee, and I talked to Dr. Gilson, yes, he is a bird person. He has had in the past a number of rescue birds, and currently, you know what, only has one?
Down to one.
We won't hold it against you, you don't have a dog, but we'll give you some time.
It's going to get a little bigger. Thank you
All
very
right.
much, everyone.
Madam President,
Yes.
may I, if I could just have a moment. First of all, I want to thank the council for your review of Dr. Gilson's qualifications. I hope that you see he was another nominee that we placed before you that we really did go in search not just in this area but across the country to find somebody of extraordinary qualifications. He'll be the last really member of our leadership team that we'll be putting into place. I hope you saw the qualities in him that we saw. We want to depoliticize the office as much as possible. If you haven't already seen some of the news coverage that's happened today, you probably will later today or in the paper tomorrow. But we are continuing to try to clean up some of the problems that happened in the coroner's office even before Dr. Gilson got there. We have about 21 layoffs that we announced today. About half of them were in the coroner's office. I think that we're lucky that we got somebody of his extraordinary qualifications that is willing to take on a very difficult assignment. But I appreciate your consideration of him and really the way the process has worked for all of our nominees. I appreciate the professionalism and how you've expedited all those. And I just want to express my appreciation to you. So thank you.
Sorry. The next item on the agenda is miscellaneous business presentation regarding the Regional Prosperity Initiative. If those folks are here and ready, we can do that. Otherwise, we can take a short break. Mr. Germano, do you want to address that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I asked them to be here at 4:30, just in
That's
case.
fine. Then we can take a short break and reconvene when they come in.
That'd be great.
All right. All right, we stand adjourned until, say, 4:30.
Just did a Google search with your name. Yes.